You don't get to hide behind classified whispers anymore, Kash Patel said evenly, staring straight at Adam Schiff. Because the moment the files come out, the story you sold for years collapses under its own weight. The audience watching at home immediately asked the same question in different forms. Why would he go that far? Why strike that hard on live television? And why did it suddenly feel less like a hearing and more like a public unmasking? Here is my answer, and I am putting it right at the start, so you know how to watch what follows. Stay until the end of this video, because the reason for that opening strike explains every document, every pause, and every word that comes next. This was never about routine FBI oversight, and it was never about partisan posturing for a viral clip. It was about narrative power, institutional protection, and what happens when the man who built a career on implication finally faces the investigator who audited the facts. And once you see that dynamic clearly, nothing about this confrontation looks accidental again. For years, Adam Schiff operated from one of the safest positions in Washington, a role where accusation required no proof and certainty could be performed without consequence. As chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, he mastered the most effective political shield of the modern era, claiming access to evidence he could not show while insisting the public simply had to trust him. That posture worked because classification created distance, and distance protected authority. Kash Patel came from the opposite side of that system, not as a commentator or a cable news regular, but as someone whose job was to verify what actually existed inside the files. This confrontation mattered because it collapsed that distance in real time. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that morning carried a tension that felt personal long before the first question was asked. Two men with years of history sat across from each other, one who had shaped public belief through repetition, and one who had spent years cross-checking claims against records. Schiff entered confident, composed, and visibly comfortable, the posture of someone who had controlled similar rooms countless times. He arranged his papers carefully, adjusted his microphone, and adopted the cadence viewers had come to associate with authority. From the first exchange, it was clear he intended to dominate by narrowing complexity into yes or no traps. Binary questions are not designed to discover truth. They are designed to manufacture clips. Schiff knew this, and he relied on it, pressing repeatedly for answers stripped of context, so that explanation itself could be framed as evasion. Patel recognized the tactic immediately, not because it intimidated him, but because he had used it himself as a federal prosecutor when facing dishonest witnesses. What Schiff did not anticipate was that Patel would refuse the premise without becoming defensive. That choice quietly shifted the power dynamic in the room. As the questioning intensified, Schiff leaned forward, repeated himself, and raised his voice just enough to signal impatience. The performance was familiar, and for years it had worked. Patel responded with steady clarity, explaining why the questions were misleading rather than refusing to answer them. Each explanation exposed the mechanics of the interrogation itself, making the tactic visible to the audience. That visibility mattered more than any single answer. By the 20-minute mark, something had changed that Schiff did not intend. Viewers were no longer evaluating Patel's responses, they were evaluating Schiff's method. The repetition began to feel less like rigor and more like insistence. The insistence began to feel less like accountability and more like pressure. And pressure, when unaccompanied by evidence, always raises suspicion. Schiff escalated by citing anonymous sources, invoking unnamed FBI officials, and vague internal reports. Anonymous claims are powerful when uncontested, but dangerous when confronted by someone with direct access to records. Patel asked for names, dates, and sworn testimony, not theatrically, but procedurally. The request exposed a weakness, because those specifics were never coming. The audience sensed the imbalance even before it was articulated. From my own perspective, this is where the psychology of the exchange becomes impossible to ignore. People often accuse others of the very abuse they most fear being exposed for. When Schiff pivoted toward accusing Patel of weaponizing the FBI, the accusation revealed more than it proved. It suggested familiarity with the tactic, not insight into the reality. And that accusation became the moment everything turned. When Patel reached for his briefcase, the room reacted before he spoke. Authority does not shift when voices rise. It shifts when explanation stops. The sound of the latch opening cut through the hearing room with unexpected sharpness. What followed was not a rebuttal, but a presentation. That distinction is why this moment did not fade like so many others. Patel framed the issue simply, stating that for years, Schiff had claimed to possess direct evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. He explained that he had reviewed every classified briefing, assessment, and document Schiff had access to during that period. And then he said plainly that the evidence Schiff claimed to have seen did not exist. This was not rhetoric, and it was not speculation. It was a statement anchored in documentation. Schiff attempted to interrupt, but the gavel stopped him. For years, Schiff had controlled the flow of classified narrative. Now, the man with the files had the floor. From that moment forward, the hearing was no longer about defending positions. It was about reconciling claims with records. This is where the first section ends, not with outrage, but with realization. Once the audience understands that certainty can be performed without proof, the rest of the confrontation becomes inevitable. What follows is not escalation, but exposure. And exposure, once it begins, does not negotiate. It simply continues. The moment the committee realized Patel wasn't improvising, the air in the room changed from political theater to procedural danger. Schiff had been building toward a clip, but Patel had opened a folder that looked like it belonged in a secure vault, not a soundbite factory. You could see staffers stop shuffling papers, because paper shuffling is what people do when they want to look busy and see it while thinking fast. A few senators leaned back, as if distance could reduce responsibility for what might be said next. And in that tiny shift, Schiff's advantage started to evaporate. Patel did not begin with insults, which is exactly why the later insult he landed like a hammer. He began with timestamps, quoting Schiff's own televised phrases, not to win a debate, but to pin a record to a wall. He described how the public had been told there was evidence that was more than circumstantial, evidence that was direct, evidence that was overwhelming. Then he explained carefully that the files he reviewed contained assessments, leads, and investigative steps, but not the smoking gun Schiff had repeatedly implied existed. The argument was not that Russia did nothing, but that Schiff's specific implication about conspiracy had been marketed with a confidence the underlying record did not support. Schiff tried to retreat into the familiar refuge of rhetoric by repeating that the intelligence community assessed interference. Patel didn't deny interference because that would have been the easiest mistake to bait him into, and he wasn't taking bait. He separated two things that politics loves to blend together, one being interference as a concept, the other being the claim of coordination as a proven conclusion. That separation is boring when you are selling a narrative, but it becomes everything when you are building accountability. And once Patel forced the room to live inside that separation, Schiff's usual escape routes narrowed. At that point, Schiff's face did what faces do when a plan stops working. It tightened, as if the skin itself was negotiating damage control. He leaned forward and tried to push the conversation back into yes or no territory, as if binary language could rebuild a collapsing frame. But Patel responded with something more humiliating than anger. He responded with patience, the kind that says, "You are not the judge in this exchange." Then Patel did something that looked small to viewers but felt massive to people in the room. He slid a page forward and kept talking without raising his voice. That calm movement turned Schiff's volume into a liability. Now, here is where my personal read comes in, and I'm going to say it plainly because it matters. When a politician spends years claiming secret certainty, they are betting that the public will never see the receipts in an understandable format. They are also betting that no one with authority will translate the internal language of agencies into plain English that a viewer can follow. Patel's strategy was exactly that translation, and it's why Schiff looked less like a prosecutor and more like a performer caught without rehearsal. And when performance loses its script, the audience can smell it immediately. Patel pivoted to surveillance authorities because that is where the abstract becomes personal for ordinary Americans. He described, in general terms, how FISA applications are supposed to work, emphasizing that they are extraordinary powers meant for extraordinary situations. Then, he referenced oversight findings that had criticized past applications for errors and omissions, framing it as a problem of process that can become a problem of rights. He didn't claim every warrant was malicious, because that would sound like conspiracy, and he knew better. He framed it as a system that can be abused when politics pushes conclusions ahead of verification. Schiff attempted to shrug it off by implying courts approved the applications, which is the standard line used to launder responsibility. Patel's reply was sharp, without being theatrical, because he pointed out that courts can only judge what they are shown. If material facts are omitted or framed in a misleading way, the approval is not a clean bill of health. It is a procedural outcome built on incomplete inputs. That line landed because it didn't require partisan loyalty to understand it. It required only common sense. And common sense is the one witness in a hearing that never lies under oath. This is where the humor, the dry kind that stays within the guardrails, started creeping in. One senator muttered, half into his microphone and half into the universe, that Washington loves oversight the way a cat loves bath time. Even some staffers cracked tight smiles, because gallows humor is how professionals handle moments that are too serious to stare at directly. The chair tried to maintain decorum, but decorum is often just a blanket thrown over a fire to pretend the heat isn't real. And the more Patel spoke in structured step-by-step language, the more Schiff's earlier theatrics looked like overacting. Then the hearing took its first truly dangerous turn, the kind that makes everybody suddenly remember the difference between commentary and allegation. Patel referenced the way public discourse around the Hunter Biden laptop had unfolded, describing how labels like disinformation can become political weapons. He was careful to use words like appeared, alleged, and reported, because a smart witness doesn't hand opponents an easy, procedural complaint. But he still delivered the core point, which was that public officials should be cautious before branding inconvenient reporting as foreign propaganda without verifiable backing. That framing was both safer and more damaging because it sounded like principle rather than revenge. Schiff tried to reassert authority by dismissing the point as a distraction, but Patel refused to be herded. He argued that the public's trust breaks not only when agencies err, but when leaders overstate certainty and then hide behind institutional language to avoid correction. He implied that Americans are tired of being told to believe unnamed sources while being discouraged from asking for primary documentation. That is not a right-wing point or a left-wing point. It is a democratic health point, and it crosses ideological lines fast. And when a point crosses ideological lines, a room full of politicians gets nervous because it's harder to contain. At this stage, Schiff's posture changed in a way that viewers might miss unless they've watched hearings for years. He stopped asking questions that sought information and started asking questions that sought dominance. He interrupted more frequently, repeated himself more aggressively, and leaned on the idea that refusal to give a binary answer equals guilt. Patel kept doing the same thing, refusing the trap while offering fuller explanations that sounded, to many viewers, like the adult in the room. That contrast is deadly on camera. Now, the controversial question that started popping up online, even as the hearing was happening, was the one nobody wants to say out loud. Was this a real oversight session, or was it a staged collision designed to produce a viral implosion? Was Schiff trying to force Patel into a clip that would damage him permanently? Or was Patel waiting for the moment to reverse the pressure and damage Schiff permanently? And if both of them came in with strategy, what does that say about the institution itself, which is supposed to be about oversight rather than spectacle? Those questions are uncomfortable, but pretending they don't exist is how institutions rot war quietly. Patel then laid out his deeper claim, which was not simply that Schiff exaggerated, but that Schiff's exaggeration had consequences. When leaders tell the public they have evidence of a specific conspiracy, and that claim becomes a central political pillar, people's lives and reputations get shaped by it. Investigations expand, media ecosystems build storylines, public trust fractures, and the subject becomes either a villain or a savior, depending on audience tribe. Patel argued that if the underlying record does not justify that level of certainty, then the damage isn't just political, it's civic. That is the kind of accusation that doesn't need shouting to feel heavy. Schiff finally did what many seasoned politicians do when control slips. He tried to moralize. He framed his own past posture as defense of democracy, implying that Patel's line of questioning was an attack on institutions. Patel didn't respond by attacking democracy. He responded by redefining what democracy requires, which is evidence and humility. He implied that democracy is not protected by confident television appearances, but by accurate claims that can survive documentation. That move forced Schiff to either argue against evidence as a standard or accept the new framework and lose the narrative advantage. And yes, this is where the audience humor got sharper, because viewers can be brutal when they sense someone is bluffing. One clip that went around later joked that Schiff was trying to interrogate Patel the way a substitute teacher interrogates a classroom, loud, confident, and secretly terrified of losing control. Another joked that the phrase yes or no had become Schiff's emotional support animal, because he kept petting it like it would calm him down. Those jokes are silly, but they carry a serious point, which is that repetition without substance reads as panic to modern audiences. And panic is contagious, especially on live television. By the time the chair attempted to steer the hearing back toward present-day FBI operations, the room no longer cared about the original agenda. Everyone knew the real story had already taken over, because the confrontation had become a referendum on credibility itself. Patel's file-driven approach had turned Schiff's reputation into a question mark. And question marks don't go away when the gavel falls. Schiff looked trapped between two bad options: either concede nuance and weaken his own years of certainty, or keep pushing and risk a sharper reversal. He chose to keep pushing, and that choice set up the collision that comes next. Because the truth is, the most dangerous moment in any hearing isn't when someone is accused. The most dangerous moment is when the accused stops defending and starts presenting. because presentation implies preparation, and preparation implies intent. Patel's body language suggested he had not walked into that room hoping to survive Schiff's questions. He walked into that room expecting Schiff to overreach, because overreach is what happens when someone is used to being protected by narrative fog. And once Schiff overreached, Patel's patience stopped looking like restraint and started looking like a countdown. By the time the third phase unfolded, the hearing no longer felt like a linear exchange of questions and answers, but like a tightening spiral that everyone in the room could sense, but not stop. The chair's attempt to restore procedural rhythm only emphasized how far the conversation had drifted from its intended script. Adam Schiff had spent years mastering the art of forward motion, keeping debates moving just fast enough that contradictions never had time to harden. Now the pace had slowed, and slow pace is lethal when documentation enters the conversation. Kash Patel understood that, and he leaned into it without ever appearing to push. What changed first was the framing of responsibility. Patel stopped responding to Schiff's questions as if they were isolated prompts and began treating them as part of a cumulative record. He spoke about patterns instead of incidents, about repetition rather than exception, and about how public trust erodes gradually before it collapses suddenly. Schiff tried to interrupt that framing because pattern recognition is the enemy of plausible deniability. But the more he interrupted, the more obvious the pattern became to anyone watching. This is where my own assessment becomes unavoidable, because the third stage of any political confrontation is where motive starts to matter more than posture. Up to this point, Schiff could plausibly argue that he was simply performing oversight, even if aggressively. But once Patel began contextualizing Schiff's past claims as a sustained narrative rather than isolated statements, intent entered the frame. And intent is dangerous, because it invites evaluation not just of what was said, but why it was said that way for so long. Viewers don't need legal training to understand that difference. Patel revisited Schiff's public certainty, not by replaying clips, but by describing their cumulative effect on institutions. He explained how repeated claims of secret evidence had justified expanded investigations, shaped media coverage, and polarized public discourse. He was careful not to say that Schiff had single-handedly caused those outcomes, because that would sound exaggerated. Instead, he described Schiff as a force multiplier, someone whose authority amplified unverified claims into accepted assumptions. That description was far more damaging than a direct accusation. Schiff responded by appealing to urgency, arguing that extraordinary threats require extraordinary vigilance. It was a familiar defense, one that resonates in moments of fear. Patel acknowledged the need for vigilance, then quietly separated vigilance from certainty. He suggested that vigilance demands humility, not absolutism, especially when evidence is incomplete. That distinction landed because it challenged Schiff's posture without denying the seriousness of the moment he claimed to be addressing. As this exchange unfolded, the room began reacting in ways that had nothing to do with partisanship. Some senators leaned forward, not to support Schiff, but to better hear Patel's explanations. Staffers stopped whispering and started typing more slowly, as if trying to capture nuance rather than quotes. Even Schiff's allies looked less animated, because defending certainty is harder when the certainty itself is under audit. The energy had shifted from confrontation to examination. Patel then addressed something politicians rarely discussed openly, which is the life cycle of a narrative once it leaves an intelligence briefing and enters public consciousness. He described how ambiguity can be useful early in an investigation, but corrosive if presented as conclusion. He suggested that the public had been trained to accept confidence as proof, and secrecy as validation. Schiff bristled at that implication because it threatened the legitimacy of his past communication strategy. But Patel was not attacking Schiff personally. He was dissecting a method. At this point, humor crept back in, subtle and uncomfortable. One observer later joked that the hearing felt like watching someone explain a magic trick to the magician who'd been selling it for years. The joke worked because it captured the asymmetry of the moment. Schiff had built authority on mystique, while Patel was dismantling mystique by explaining mechanics. And once mechanics are explained, the magic doesn't come back. Schiff tried to regain footing by reframing the discussion as a matter of good faith. He suggested that disagreements about interpretation do not equal dishonesty. Patel agreed, then added that good faith requires correction when facts fail to support prior certainty. He asked whether Schiff had ever publicly recalibrated his claims as investigations progressed and evidence failed to materialize. That question hung unanswered because it struck too close to the center. From a political analysis standpoint, this was the moment where Schiff's problem became temporal. If he admitted overstatement, he undermined years of messaging. If he denied overstatement, he reinforced the perception that he had doubled down despite contrary findings. Patel did not need to say this explicitly because the dilemma was visible. The audience could see the trap without anyone pointing at it. Patel then pivoted toward institutional consequences, emphasizing how overstated claims affect future investigations. When leaders exaggerate certainty and are later proven wrong, public skepticism hardens, even toward legitimate warnings. That dynamic, he argued, damages national security more than cautious transparency ever could. Schiff attempted to counter by invoking the responsibility to alert the public early. Patel responded that alerting is different from assuring, and conflating the two is reckless. This distinction resonated beyond the room because it spoke to a broader fatigue many Americans feel. People are tired of being told something is definitively true, only to be told later that nuance was always implied. Patel gave voice to that fatigue without sounding populist or dismissive of expertise. Schiff, by contrast, sounded increasingly like someone defending a legacy rather than clarifying a record. That contrast matters more than ideology in moments like this. As tension rose, Schiff's questions grew shorter and sharper, while Patel's answers grew longer and more explanatory. On television, that dynamic reads as imbalance. The questioner looks impatient, and the witness looks composed. Viewers instinctively trust the person who appears willing to explain. Schiff's frustration, though understandable, began working against him. Another controversial question surfaced in the public commentary that day, one that still lingers. If Schiff truly believed his claims were justified, why had he resisted full declassification when opportunities arose? Was it caution, or was it protection of narrative leverage? Patel did not accuse him of either, but the question did not need explicit articulation to exist. Once the audience starts asking it, control is already lost. The third phase ends not with a dramatic outburst, but with something more corrosive to authority. Doubt. Schiff was no longer seen as unquestionably reliable, even by those inclined to support him. Patel was no longer just a witness, but a lens through which past claims were being re-examined. That shift did not require shouting or spectacle. It required time, documentation, and a refusal to simplify what had been oversold. As the chair moved to recognize the next line of questioning, the room felt different than it had an hour earlier. The audience was no longer waiting for a winner. They were waiting for consequences. And when an audience starts expecting consequences, the next phase is never about rhetoric. It is about exposure. By the time the fourth phase began, the hearing had crossed an invisible threshold, the kind that separates debate from reckoning. This was no longer about competing interpretations or political framing, because the underlying assumption of good faith had quietly eroded. Adam Schiff sensed it, and that awareness showed not in what he said, but in how carefully he chose what not to say. Caution replaced confidence, and caution, in a moment that demands clarity, reads like retreat. Kash Patel did not press harder. He simply widened the lens. Patel shifted from past claims to institutional behavior, outlining how narratives become embedded inside bureaucratic decision-making. He explained that when senior political figures project certainty, agencies downstream feel pressure to conform to that certainty. Not because anyone explicitly orders them to, but because alignment feels safer than dissent. Schiff objected to that characterization, insisting that agencies operate independently. Patel responded that independence weakens when political reward favors confirmation over contradiction. From an analytical standpoint, this exchange revealed something deeper than disagreement. It exposed how power operates indirectly, through expectation rather than instruction. Patel never accused Schiff of issuing commands because that would be easy to deny. Instead, he described a climate, one where deviation from a dominant narrative carried professional risk. That description resonated with anyone who has worked inside large institutions. Schiff attempted to reclaim authority by invoking process, reminding the room that intelligence assessments involve multiple agencies and layers of review. Patel agreed, then pointed out that multi-agency consensus often reflects shared assumptions rather than independently verified conclusions. He emphasized that consensus is only as reliable as the evidence it rests upon. When evidence is thin, consensus becomes fragile, even if it appears strong on paper. That observation unsettled the room because it challenged a foundational belief about institutional reliability. This is where subtle humor returned, not as mockery, but as release. One senator remarked off mic that the hearing felt less like a trial and more like a peer review gone wrong. The comment circulated quickly because it captured the tone perfectly. Schiff was defending a published conclusion, while Patel was questioning the methodology behind it. In academic terms, methodology always wins. Patel then addressed the cost of certainty without correction. He spoke about how intelligence failures are rarely the result of malice, but of momentum. Once a story gains velocity, stopping it requires more courage than starting it. Schiff shifted in his chair because momentum had been his ally for years. Now it was being reframed as liability. Schiff responded by asserting that hindsight unfairly simplifies complex decisions made under pressure. Patel acknowledged the role of pressure, then asked whether pressure justifies refusing recalibration when new information emerges. The question was not hostile, but it was precise. Schiff answered in generalities, emphasizing ongoing concern and vigilance. The absence of specificity was noticed immediately. From the audience's perspective, this was the moment Schiff's authority began to feel conditional rather than absolute. He sounded like someone defending the idea of responsibility rather than demonstrating it. Patel, by contrast, sounded like someone comfortable with uncertainty, which paradoxically made him appear more credible. Certainty impresses initially, but humility sustains trust. The fourth phase made that contrast unmistakable. Patel then returned to the theme of accountability, not as punishment, but as obligation. He argued that public officials owe the public not just transparency, but proportionality. Claims should scale with evidence, not exceed it. Schiff bristled at the implication that he had exceeded anything, but Patel did not accuse. He measured, At this point, the hearing room felt quieter, not because people were disengaged, but because they were processing. This was no longer entertainment. It was institutional self-examination unfolding live. Viewers who had tuned in expecting confrontation found themselves watching something slower and more consequential. That shift explains why this phase lingered in public memory. Another controversial question began circulating online during this segment, and it mattered because it did not originate from either man. If exaggeration becomes normalized during politically charged investigations, how does the public ever distinguish urgency from alarmism? The question cut across party lines because it implicated everyone. Patel did not need to voice it. The audience already had. Schiff's discomfort suggested he knew it. Schiff tried one last time to reassert narrative control by returning to motive. He implied that Patel's perspective was shaped by loyalty to former political figures. Patel did not deny relationships, but reframed loyalty as fidelity to records rather than individuals. He said that documents do not change based on who reads them. That line landed harder than any accusation could have. From a strategic standpoint, Schiff's problem was now structural. He could challenge Patel's tone, but not his citations. He could question intent, but not documentation. And once documentation anchors the conversation, rhetorical agility loses its advantage. The fourth phase locked that reality into place. As this segment concluded, the chair attempted again to move the hearing forward. But momentum had already shifted beyond procedural control. The audience no longer saw this as an oversight session. They saw it as an audit of credibility. And audits, once begun, rarely end quietly. By the time the fifth phase began, the hearing had acquired a gravity that no amount of procedural framing could undo. This was no longer about who asked better questions or who delivered sharper answers, because the exchange had crossed into something more enduring. The audience was now evaluating credibility across time, not performance within a single afternoon. Adam Schiff understood that, and the awareness weighed visibly on him. Kash Patel, by contrast, appeared increasingly comfortable, not because the moment was easy, but because it aligned with his preparation. Patel shifted again, this time toward consequences rather than causes. He spoke about how prolonged certainty, when later disproven, does not simply fade away, but leaves institutional scars. Agencies become risk-averse, journalists become cynical, and the public becomes suspicious of every future warning. Schiff attempted to push back by emphasizing the need to err on the side of caution. Patel responded that caution loses meaning when it is indistinguishable from assertion. From an analytical perspective, this exchange mattered because it reframed accountability as forward-looking rather than punitive. Patel was not demanding apology or retraction. He was asking whether systems had learned anything from the experience. Schiff's responses suggested discomfort with that framing because learning implies prior error, and error threatens legacy. Schiff then pivoted toward institutional loyalty, invoking the intelligence community's collective judgment. Patel acknowledged the professionalism of analysts, then separated analysis from amplification. He suggested that analysis informs policy, but amplification shapes public belief. Schiff had not merely received intelligence, he had translated it into certainty for millions. That distinction made his role uniquely consequential. At this stage, even sympathetic observers began noting the asymmetry. Schiff spoke as if defending a record already written. Patel spoke as if describing a process still unfolding. One posture looks backward, the other forward. In politics, backward-looking defenses rarely inspire confidence. Subtle humor surfaced again, this time from commentators rather than participants. Several noted that Schiff sounded like someone explaining why a forecast made sense at the time, even though it never came true. The analogy resonated because it captured the core issue. Accuracy is judged by outcome, not intention. Patel never needed to say that explicitly. Schiff attempted to reassert moral authority by invoking the threat environment of the period. He reminded the room that foreign interference was real and ongoing. Patel agreed, then asked whether real threats justify overstating specific claims. The silence after that question spoke louder than any rebuttal. It was not a trap. It was an invitation to reflect. From the viewer's perspective, the fifth phase felt like the emotional center of the hearing. This was where the abstract became personal, where institutional decisions translated into public trust or distrust. Patel spoke about agents, analysts, and civil servants caught between evidence and expectation. Schiff listened, but his posture suggested resistance rather than recognition. That resistance cost him more than any factual dispute. Another controversial question emerged organically during this segment. If leaders are never required to correct overstatements, what incentive exists to be precise in the first place? Patel did not ask it aloud, but his entire argument pointed toward it. Schiff's inability to address that implication directly left it hanging. Unanswered questions linger longer than answered ones. As the phase progressed, Schiff's language became more abstract, more procedural, more removed. Patel's language became more grounded, more specific, more human. That contrast matters in public-facing accountability moments. People trust specificity because it signals contact with reality. Abstraction, even when accurate, feels like avoidance under pressure. The chair attempted to steer the hearing back toward administrative matters, sensing fatigue. But fatigue did not dissipate attention. It sharpened it. The audience was no longer reacting emotionally. They were evaluating quietly. That is the most dangerous phase for anyone defending a contested record. By the end of this segment, Schiff had lost something that cannot be regained through rebuttal. He had lost the assumption of unquestioned authority. Once that assumption breaks, every future claim carries additional weight. Patel did not declare victory. He did not need to. The fifth phase closed with an atmosphere of unresolved tension rather than catharsis. Nothing had been definitively settled, but much had been destabilized. Viewers sensed that the final stage would not be about argument at all. It would be about aftermath. And aftermath is where narratives either endure or collapse. By the time the final phase arrived, the hearing had already done its most consequential work, even if no formal verdict was ever announced. What remained was not argument but absorption, the slow recognition that something irreversible had occurred in public view. Adam Schiff sat with the posture of someone who understood that control had slipped, not dramatically, but definitively. Kash Patel did not press for a closing statement because closure was already forming in the audience's mind. In politics, the moment you stop shaping interpretation is the moment interpretation begins shaping you. This last stage was about aftermath, not spectacle. Viewers were no longer replaying individual exchanges, but reassessing years of commentary, interviews, and confident assertions. The question was no longer whether Schiff believed what he had said, but whether belief without correction was sufficient. Patel's restraint here mattered more than any accusation because it signaled confidence in the record rather than reliance on rhetoric. Silence, when earned, is more persuasive than emphasis. From my perspective, this is where the confrontation revealed its deepest lesson. Power in Washington is often exercised through implication rather than declaration, through tone rather than evidence. Schiff had mastered that language, and for a long time it worked. Patel disrupted it not by shouting louder, but by insisting that implication eventually answered to documentation. That insistence cannot be undone once the public sees it modeled. In the days following the hearing, reactions followed a predictable arc. Partisan defenses emerged quickly, framing the exchange as political theater. But those defenses weakened as transcripts circulated and clips were replayed in full rather than excerpted. Context, which had once protected certainty, now undermined it. The longer people watched, the harder it became to dismiss the substance. Schiff's supporters argued that intent mattered more than outcome, that vigilance justified strong language. Patel's defenders countered that vigilance loses legitimacy when it resists recalibration. Neither side needed to exaggerate, because the confrontation itself had already exposed the fault line. This was not about left versus right. It was about whether authority is allowed to persist without correction. The most telling reaction came not from politicians, but from the audience. Many expressed a familiar fatigue, the exhaustion of being told to trust conclusions that never fully materialize. Others admitted discomfort at realizing how much weight they had placed on confidence alone. Patel had not asked them to switch sides. He had asked them to re-examine standards. This is why the initial shock mattered so much. When Patel struck hard at the beginning, it was not to dominate the moment, but to signal that insulation was gone. The audience's question, "Why go that far?" was answered not with justification, but with exposure. By the end, the reason was obvious. The strike was not personal. It was structural. Schiff did not leave the hearing disgraced in the theatrical sense. There was no gavel slam that ended a career, no dramatic walkout. What he lost was something subtler and more damaging: narrative immunity. Every future claim would now be filtered through this confrontation. That is a consequence no rebuttal can erase. Patel's role, in contrast, solidified in a way that extends beyond this single exchange. He positioned himself as someone unwilling to trade clarity for comfort, even under pressure. That posture carries risks, but it also builds credibility that compounds over time. Whether one agrees with him politically is almost beside the point. He demonstrated a model of accountability that demands engagement rather than allegiance. As the video circulated, the humor that followed reflected relief rather than mockery. Viewers joked that the hearing felt like a syllabus correction after years of misgraded exams. The joke worked because it captured a shared realization. Authority had been trusted without sufficient audit. Now the audit had begun. The final implication of this confrontation reaches beyond the two men involved. It challenges a system that rewards certainty more than accuracy. It warns that classification cannot permanently shield overstatement. And it reminds audiences that confidence, however polished, is not evidence. Those lessons do not fade quickly. When people ask what this hearing ultimately changed, the answer is not a single policy or outcome. It changed expectations. Once viewers see that claims can be questioned calmly, persistently, and with documentation, they begin demanding that standard everywhere. That demand is uncomfortable for institutions built on deference, but it is essential for credibility. The opening strike now makes sense in hindsight. It was not an attack designed to humiliate, but a signal that the rules of engagement had shifted. "Stay until the end," Patel implicitly told the audience, because the end explains the beginning. And by the end, the explanation was unavoidable. This was not a clash of personalities, but a reckoning between narrative and record. In American politics, reckoning rarely arrives loudly. It arrives slowly, through accumulation, through comparison, through the quiet erosion of unquestioned belief. This hearing was one of those moments, not because it ended an argument, but because it changed how arguments will be judged. And once that standard shifts, nothing ever sounds the same again.